Navy officials now say there are reports of fatalities at the Washington Naval Yard in Washington, D.C. after a shooter got inside the Naval Sea Systems Command headquarters building this morning. Several injuries are also being reported. Emergency personnel were on the scene and a shelter-in-place order was issued for Navy Yard personnel.
At approximately 1600 or 4 p.m. today, a soldier assigned to 13th Sustainment Command Expeditionary fired shots at individuals within the unit areas here.
Ladies and gentlemen, as Admiral Hillard has indicated, our Navy lost 12 teammates during Monday's attack. These were members of our Navy family. These were our shipmates.
A member of the Royal Saudi Air Force entered a building on grounds of the Pensacola Naval Air Station and killed 3 U.S. sailors and severely wounded 8 other Americans. He was killed during the attack. This was an act of terrorism. The evidence shows that the shooter was motivated by jihadist ideology.
It was an attack on innocent children and defenseless citizens. It was an act of cowardice, and it was evil.
As you can see from the video, targeted violence that is motivated by extreme thinking and ideology is not just an issue in society. It is being done at the hands of active duty members, military employees, and veterans. This stand down day on extremism is not about reacting to one event, like the recent attack on our nation's capital. This is a violent trend that has been going on for years and even decades. It is also important to understand that no one just snaps. These are not examples of random acts of violence by madmen, nor were any of these violent attacks caused by mental illness alone, like many people think or some in the media like to say. These types of attacks are premeditated, predatory, and planned. They are all examples of targeted violence. Some of these attackers were motivated by a specific ideology. Some were motivated by a single issue or a grievance, but all of their thinking had progressed to extreme. And they all engaged in behaviors that have been identified by the research as indicators for targeted violence. And these behaviors were observed by others for months and even years before the violent attack occurred. We're going to discuss those indicators in the next section, but first we need to understand how someone progresses from simply having a belief or an opinion and escalates into becoming a full-on extremist. And of course, we're going to chat about those psychological and the social science involved in that progression. Now let's get into what extremism looks like and discuss the factors that potentially make all of us vulnerable to the process of becoming extreme. I'm often asked what are the physical identifiers of an extremist group, and that is a difficult question to answer because there are so many. There are so many extremists and hate groups out there. It's really unfortunate, and therefore there are a ton of symbols, and we don't have time to cover them all today. But I encourage you all to check out the Hate on Display website at adl.org or Anti-Defamation League. It's a great database that does list many of the symbols used by various extremists and hate groups. Check it out. Now, I do want to talk about physical indicators in general. Extremist groups strategically use symbology for a number of reasons. Symbols are an extension of language that is visual, easily digestible, meaning it's easy to understand, and it's catchy. Symbols are also often used to try to avoid detection from others, like law enforcement. Basically, symbols are used to construct a shared identity, reinforce that identity, and then validate it. Extremist groups use symbols to identify membership in the in-group. They use it for recruitment purposes and for propaganda activities. It comes in the form of all kinds of things. It can be numbers, objects, figures, emblems, logos. Often they'll have mission statements, or maybe they'll use acronyms, emojis, you name it. Now, symbols can be seen in the form of things like tattoos, flags, stickers, shirts, hats, patches, badges, really anything. In many cases, an extremist group develops its own internal lexicon or language that will include specific terms to identify the in-group and the targeted out-group. Nowadays, we see lots of memes and hashtags on social media that include extremist symbology. Since we can't realistically show you all the different symbols, we're going to instead focus on the behaviors. Focusing on behaviors is the best way to identify extremism. You also want to be sure that you are not profiling a certain type of person based on their personal attributes or physical traits, who they are. You want to focus on the what, not the who, on the behaviors. All right, so now let's discuss some specific risk factors for extremism. Dr. Reed Malloy is a threat assessment and extremist expert who has been researching topics related to targeted violence, extremism, and radicalization for decades. He has developed a method of assessing extremism and radicalization called the Terrorist Radicalization Protocol, or the TRAP-18, in which he describes 10 behavioral characteristics of extremism or radicalization, and also 8 warning behaviors, which again, we're going to discuss in the next section. But now we want to focus on those 10 risk factors that are specific to extremism and radicalization. The first one is something called personal grievance with a moral outrage. Now, what does that mean? This means an individual harbors a perceived injustice. They feel like they've been wronged in some way and they cannot let it go. Moral outrage is when they then perceive suffering of the in-group at the hands of the targeted out-group. And again, we're not talking about a normal grievance. We all experience grievances from time to time. But in this situation, the individual cannot let it go. The next specific risk factor we're going to discuss is something called framed by an ideology. Now, this is when the ideology has consumed the individual and they start to justify all of their behavior, to include feeling justified in engaging in impermissible behaviors, or perhaps justified in advocating for engaging in criminal or violent acts, or actually engaging in criminal or violent acts themselves. Remember, they tend to think that their viewpoint and belief is the ultimate truth, and all others are meaningless. Therefore, they may feel that policies and laws don't apply to them, and they feel justified in doing whatever they want based on their ideology. Now, another specific risk factor to extremism is something called failure to affiliate with other groups. Now, what does this mean? This basically means that in many cases, you'll see that the extremist either rejects a group that they were affiliated with that had shared their belief for not being extreme enough. Or the flip side, perhaps a group that the individual was affiliated with rejects them for becoming too extreme. Another risk factor that we see that is specific to extremism is dependence on the virtual community. This one's pretty self-explanatory. They rely on the virtual community because the internet allows for all kinds of extremist and violent rhetoric without consequences. Another risk factor specific to extremism is thwarting of occupational or educational goals. And what this means is, we all have education and occupational goals, but someone who's drifting into extremism or who is already there has a harder time being able to accomplish these basic life goals. They have a tendency to blame the targeted outgroup and see any thwarting of their goals as more justification for hostile and violent action. Now, another risk factor specific to extremism, failure of sexually intimate pair bonding. Now, this is when an individual may desire a long-term successful relationship, but they have problems being able to form a lasting intimate relationship. And think about it. If someone who is framed by an extremist ideology, they're typically very difficult to get along with. And as you can imagine, that impacts their ability to find these lasting, successful relationships. Now, probably one of the most important risk factors specific to extremism is something called changes in thinking and emotions. This is when you see the individual becoming more and more absolute in their belief system. They no longer can debate or discuss an issue without becoming angry. They tend to preach their views as if it is the absolute truth. They may show disdain for and contempt for any other point of view, and will often show disgust towards anyone that is not in the in-group. They tend to come off as self-righteous and superior to everyone else. Now, another risk factor specific to extremism is having a mental disorder. Now, I want to be clear that when an individual exhibits symptoms of mental health disorder, this alone is not the concern. And it's hardly ever the actual cause of the extremism. It's when the mental illness is combined with other risk factors or warning behaviors. That's the concern. For example, one thing we see is when someone becomes more and more extreme, we may see higher rates in mental illness in those people who adhere to extremism. And a particular concern is when there is evidence of suicidal thinking in addition to extremist beliefs and behaviors. Suicidal thoughts and behaviors can easily turn into motivation for becoming a martyr in the name of their ideology, whether it's political, social, religious, or a single issue. Now, another risk factor to look out for is something called creativity and innovation. When an individual moves into radicalization, they may start to fantasize about or even start to plan engaging in violence. And remember, they often desire to get as much attention to their violent act as possible. This leads them to thinking of certain creative ways, innovative ways to try to commit violence in order to get as much attention on their violent act as possible. Now, the last risk factor that we're going to talk about is a history of violence or criminality. A history of rule-breaking behaviors or past violence tells us that the individual is already desensitized to breaking laws and acting violently. So what's going to stop them from doing it again? Now, an important point I want to make is that a risk factor is not the same thing as a warning behavior or an indicator. Risk factors increase the likelihood of an outcome. For example, it could mean that violence is possible. Now, indicators or warning behaviors indicate proximity to the outcome or the presence of it. For example, violence is more probable or more likely to occur or is in the process of occurring. Now, we're going to discuss those indicators or warning behaviors later on. But now we're going to pause again for a short break to allow you to discuss another fictional case study and apply what we just learned. Now, as you read this case, identify any use of symbols or any general risk factors that you hear or see, and also what risk factors that are specific to extremism can you identify in the case example. Remember, it's best to focus on the what, not the who, the behaviors. Also, observing certain behaviors, like risk factors, does not automatically mean that person is going to be the next domestic violent extremist. but it is certainly something that you want to address or call to the attention of your superiors before that individual has the opportunity to progress further into the world of extremism. Now we're going to take a look at what that looks like in the next section.